But onto another really important electoral issue this cycle, which is the US-Israel genocide in Gaza and the escalating war in West Asia. Certainly, the Biden administration was instrumental in funding, perpetuating, and escalating in this region. But obviously, Trump also has a record of being extremely pro-Israel, to the point where Israel far-right PM Netanyahu openly backed his election. And also, if you remember too, during the Biden-Trump US presidential debates, Trump said Israel needed to finish the job in Gaza and actually called Biden, who was overseeing the genocide, a Palestinian. Sequoyah, can you speak to what Trump's return means for this region?
Certainly, and thanks for that introduction. A bit like the previous answer, I think it's worth us traveling to the global south to get an opinion. But before doing so, I think you'll all be familiar, certainly in the US and UK, with this absurd condemnation game that took place since October 2023. So I just think it's a perfect opportunity to make my own views very clear, that I unequivocally and without any qualification condemn the settler colonial genocidal entity named Israel and hope for a fully liberated Palestine. Now, to get the view of one particular Palestinian who was asked whether there would be a difference in the election of Trump or Harris, is a retired university teacher called Ayad Barghouti, and they said, what Biden was doing before with a low profile, Trump will be more vocal about. Biden would say in public, we're not trying to starve Gaza, we're trying to give them food aid, all the while supporting Israel's army. Trump will say it in a clear way that we're trying to get rid of such and such people. He will not play the game of trying to make himself sound like a humanitarian. Similarly, another Palestinian was asked the same question. What we have seen has made us believe the whole of Western ideology is a lie. And this is the sort of contradiction, if you like, of so-called Western values. They'll destroy your land, kill your people, and tell you it's because they care. But at least when it comes to Trump, the veil is off, and the liberal mind cannot claim to be fooled. But as Matthew sort of alluded to, or rather very clearly stated, will anything actually change? Now, we don't have time right now to do a sort of thorough overview of all the barbarity that's taken place. Such is the scale of a year of genocide. But suffice to say, starvation, massacre, bombing every school, university, hospital, and very conservative estimates of 42,000 people killed, but could be up to the Lancet, for example, quoted as being around 180, maybe even 300,000 people killed. And it's worth just pointing out while we're discussing this, the horrendous and absurd propaganda in the West, the UK and the US in particular, that describes Israel's clear, both in terms of intent and actions, genocidal horrors that they inflict on Palestine as self-defense. And I think it is important to note in terms of international law that that's not even accurate. As an occupying force, they don't have a right to self-defense against those for whom they occupy. And just to note, I think it's important to state clearly as well that it's not just the right-wing media, so Fox News or The Sun, etc. in the UK and the US. It's the New York Times, Washington Post, BBC, Guardian, the so-called liberal progressive wing of the corporate media, who have published absurd claims. Again, if we have time, we can go into a bit more detail about the role that propaganda has played both for Democrats and Trump's actions. And just one last point on that. There's a particular phrase that's done the rounds, which is every accusation is a confession, in that Israel will take some of the most extreme and heinous acts that they've committed, some of which were decades ago, for example, putting a baby in an oven, pulling a woman's uterus out, etc., and claiming Palestinians have done that. And it's important for us to understand the role of that atrocity propaganda, whether it was a Biden regime or Trump. And just to say, I think everyone here and anyone listening will be familiar with seeing the videos over the last year that are frankly some of the most horrific, the worst things that any of us have seen in any context. One of the most prominent examples was Hind, Rajab, but there's others such as Sidra, Reem, the young girl whose grandfather famously described as the soul of my soul. Again, we can go into more of these, but what I think is astounding and will likely continue is the level of impunity afforded to the Israeli regime. And we have this odd and frankly sickening phenomenon with this generation of TikTok soldiers who are committing genocide, where they not only commit a crime, they not only admit it, not only celebrate it, not only film it, not only film themselves celebrating it, but they also then post it. And we have this situation of these multiple levels of evil being publicly celebrated, and that was under a Democrat. And so we've got Trump stating that he's happy to support and is a great friend of Netanyahu. So it is massively worrying. But as has been said, Biden has not just been complicit, he's been a central player in arming, along with Western allies, or I think possibly more accurate to describe them as Western proxies in Europe. But a quick appraisal of what the Biden regime has done to assist the genocide, and I would open it to others as well and say, do you think any of these things would be any different under Trump? It's questionable at best. They blocked UN resolutions, and as we know, the UN is supposed to be the international body that provides a mandate for action according to the UN Charter and Genocide Convention. And again, I think this is a very important point. It's a slight aside, but a worthwhile one. In the sort of history of recent Western interventions, there's this ridiculous discourse around the notion of humanitarian intervention and responsibility to protect, which has its so-called intellectual heavyweights in figures like Samantha Power, Bernard Henri Levy, etc. And you would expect those people in this instant as almost the ultimate textbook case of humanitarian intervention to be shouting from the rooftops, but it's notable you don't hear it anywhere. The Biden regime has also put pressure on the ICC, which has still not issued arrests warrants, and has also tried to put pressure on South Africa in relation to its case with the International Court of Justice. And for anyone listening, I would strongly recommend reading their summary of the recent report they submitted to the ICJ, and similarly the very detailed report written by this UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese. And yet, when it comes to Biden, they want us to believe that they embody human rights. Now, the Democrats, including, some of you might be familiar with this person, Matthew Miller, who has this almost vampiric look about him, they, I think, are very lucky that the worst so far that they've had to endure is humiliation of an electoral defeat, because their punishment, frankly, should be far worse. But there is at least one small consolation in that their legacy, and certainly their names, will be remembered this way, will be one of genocide, of course, genocide Joe and Holocaust Harris. But again, will any of this change under Trump? I think it was really interesting, Matthew, that you used a formulation of this similar phrase that I always try to understand or predict people in political realm actions by their deeds shall ye know them, in that you will get 1,000,001 different things said, but if you've got a past record of the deeds, this is the strongest predictor or indicator of their actions. And this is somewhat of a reiteration, but I think it's worth saying again, looking at his record, Trump bombed 8 countries. And this point is often forgotten, even on the left. It was the strongest conventional bomb used in human history, but Trump dropped the so-called Moab on Afghanistan. And again, I always come back to these thought experiments. Can you imagine if Russia had dropped the Moab on Belgium or something? Everyone would know about it. And it's one of those things that it's a major event and crime, but is almost written out of history. Again, as you said, in terms of Palestine, recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, tore up numerous long-standing international missile treaties, and scrapped CPO Iran. But again, I'm going to reiterate slightly Matthew's point, but a very slightly different formulation. So personnel is policy. I just saw it the other day and I quite liked it, that the personnel is political. This is another little sort of reformulation of the same point, but also, again, a bit of a reiteration here, but I think there are some slight differences in emphasis between the different wings in terms of who they are more likely and willing to target. There was that old adage in some neoconservative foreign policy circles around real men go to Iran. And I think some of that wing really see Iran as the test, if you like. So I think the Democrats, it's Russia, and they're harsher when it comes to DPRK, North Korea, whereas the Trump regime is much likely to be harsher with China and Iran. It's worth just quickly mentioning, of course, the ridiculous astronomical amounts that the US spends on so-called defense, between 800 billion and a trillion budget for murder and destruction. And these weapons, of course, need to be tested on something, or rather, as we know, someone. And I don't think there's going to be any structural changes there, despite some of the rhetoric from Trump around no wars and we will get immediate peace in Ukraine and, as he describes it, the Middle East. Another factor when it comes to Palestine and influence, again, I think this was touched upon, but I think there's definitely space to talk more about the influence and impact of the lobbying system, that basically a form of legalized constitutional corruption in the US, and AIPAC is a significant component of that. 365 out of 435 representatives are funded by Israel, of foreign countries. And what's perhaps striking about it is the fact that they willingly brag about it, so that they'll happily post these details. And then in the same breath, people will talk about Russian interference. And you'll say, where? What do you mean? Oh, a few Facebook posts, right? And then you've got this whole massive campaign of lobbying that has significant influence. I will say another quick point, because I think it's important, because a lot of people listening will likely come from sort of progressive backgrounds. It's important to clarify the dynamic when it comes to AIPAC and lobbying. Israel does not control the US. It's the other way around. Israel is essentially a strategic forward base for US and Western geostrategic interests, and it bombs common enemies with the West, so Syria, Lebanon, Iran. That's not coincidence. It's not to say AIPAC doesn't have influence, it certainly does, but they're more successful as a lobby group because they align with US strategy in West Asia. And these dynamics are present as the Palestinians who were asked this question very much, they know very clearly and experience it very clearly. It's also worth mentioning in this context the role of the arms trade, if you like, and the fact that some people say, oh, they're giving lots of arms, they're giving lots of money to Israel, but in effect, they're subsidizing their own arms industries with public money. So they're making a lot of money, although, yes, on paper, they're giving 3.8 billion or thereabouts a year in subsidies to Israel, but a lot of it gets washed back in to that corporate economy. One important way in which Trump might make things worse, though, for Palestine relates to Israel's intended destruction of the UN relief agency, UNRWA. It provides basic services to around 870,000 Palestinians in the West Bank and the vast majority in Gaza. And Trump previously, again, coming back to that by the deeds, shall you know them point, suspended funding to UNRWA in 2018. Now, it all sounds very depressing, and because the situation is dire when it comes to Palestine, certainly. But being someone who's based in the UK, and we've got colleagues in the US, there are actions that people can take. And yes, I think protest is one of those key things that's very important. But I think this last year has shown the limitations of A to B marches. So I would suggest that people both in the US, and it's becoming increasingly more successful, look into direct action and civil disobedience groups like Palestine Action. Again, we can talk more about this if there's time. Another point, just to sort of counter the doom and gloom point, is even in Western countries, the vast majority of the people in most of those countries support a ceasefire. I know the bar's low there, but at least they're not all genocidal maniacs. A quick word, because I'm conscious of time, but the configuration when it comes to the rest of West Asia, be it in Lebanon, Iran, Yemen, Syria, etc., I think some of the key dynamics will remain under Trump. I think they will still be providing arms to Israel to bomb Lebanon. Hopefully, the resistance will be able to retain its deterrence. At the moment, Israel's not been able to make inroads in the south of Lebanon, and every time they're successfully resisted, they respond by killing civilians, which seems to be one of their formulations. And just a word on Iran, because I do think there is potential danger of a evolution of Trump's kind of maximum pressure policy. He, of course, pulled out of the JCPO deal in 2015, killed Soleimani, as has been mentioned. So there are potential grounds for escalation, again, because of the personnel as well. So I think we have a responsibility in the West to try to counter that where it's possible. Similarly, with Yemen, I think that Ansar Allah, or Houthis as they're often referred to, have done amazing work in solidarity with Palestine, but they're likely to be victims of Trump's bombs. And again, this is always worth mentioning because people, even on the left, tend not to be aware or tend not to talk about this, but the US still occupies a significant proportion of Syria, around 1/3 of the country, the oil-rich part. So if there is even the tiniest bit of hope that any of what Trump says is remotely true, perhaps we can be hopeful of some sort of withdrawal there. But in terms of the resistance axis, I think the fundamental same forces are going to be at play. But just to come back quickly to Anna's point, in terms of the broader historical trajectory of the geopolitics, if you like, there is some hope with the development of BRICS, this multipolar moment, and we're seeing the global south converge and grow those links. And in many cases, they've become a lot more comprehensive and strategic, which will help, something we haven't really touched upon today, but will help counter the effects of things like sanctions as well, which the US sanctions a whole third of the world. So just conscious, because there's so much to say about West Asia, but ultimately significantly echoing what's said earlier, but I think it was really important for us to be able to give a bit of a zoomed out overview of the situation in Palestine. It is very difficult and we see the horrors daily, but we have a responsibility in our own countries to take what action we can and hope that the resistance axis deliver appropriately against the genocidal regimes there.